Can people hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. So my topic is biosemiotics against nihilism, and then looking at what kind of discourse it is, whether it's science, literature, or metaphysics, or all of them. And I'll argue that it's all of them. That metaphysics, it's actually central to the development of a metaphysical revolution, challenging the metaphysics that really has dominated modernity. And that might sound a bit grand, but I think that if you look at what's happening in the world, the development of the technosphere and so on, our destruction of the global ecosystem, you can see that there's something fundamentally wrong with it. And it's associated with deep assumptions that were put place in the 17th century. So the first person to, I think, really fully recognize the significance of this was Nietzsche. I mean, he was echoing other people before, but it was Nietzsche who really focused on it. And he talked about the nihilism and how that's threatening us. First pages of Nietzsche's Will to Power characterize it, talks about nihilism stands at the door, and talks about whence comes this uncanniest of all guess. Everything lacks meaning. In the first, early before that, I should have written this down. He talked about his work as what I relate is the history of the next 2 centuries. I describe what is coming, what can no longer come differently, the advent of nihilism. So what does nihilism mean? That the highest values devaluate themselves. The aim is lacking. Why finds no answer. Radical nihilism is the conviction of an absolute untenability of existence when it comes to the highest values one recognizes. Now, most people think of Nietzsche as an anti-Christian philosopher. In some extent, he is, because he looks at the role of Christianity in engendering this nihilism. In actual fact, what he was focusing on more was the advance of science. He studied the development of Boltzmann's ideas and was horrified at their implications. So he really was talking about the advance of natural science, which had gained the power to define reality, pushing aside the arts, and that's what he was celebrating to begin with. The consequence of that, he thought, would be absolutely disastrous. And to some extent, you can say that he was right on that. So, talking about the whole issue of meaning, what we find is a world that seems to be deprived of meaning. Where people do invoke meaning, their discourse tends to be regarded as inferior to the really important discourse of developing science, which has this capacity to develop our control over the world, developing technology in weapons or in making companies profitable or whatever. Another thinker who really concurred with this was Alfred North Whitehead. In Science in the Modern World, he argued that there'd been a metaphysical revolution inaugurating scientific materialism, construing nature as nothing but matter, moving silently, endlessly, meaninglessly, with colours, sense, and everything else, anything of value located in the corners of people's brains, and that has to include meaning. Colours and so on, sense, are projected onto this meaningless objective world, but the objective world is just there, and it's meaningless. He talked about Cartesian dualism to some extent, ameliorating this, and it's associated then with the division between the sciences and the humanities. But he talked about that division being weakening of the whole of modernist culture. And if you look at what's happened since Whitehead wrote, you can see that what Nietzsche was talking about has really come to pass. That is that reductionist science has extended itself so that living beings are now characterized as machines for reproducing DNA, and we're regarded as information processing cyborgs, perhaps inefficient information processing cyborgs who can be replaced by more efficient, artificial forms of intelligence. And so I think that Whitehead's work aligns itself or supplements Nietzsche's work, but Nietzsche had the longer term vision of where we're heading. But the importance of Whitehead, I think, is to recognize that science is based on metaphysics. And that provides some hope that you can question these metaphysical assumptions of science. So where does biosemiotics fit into all this? It's interesting that in some argo, the journal Biosemiotics is categorized as a social science journal encompassing communication, linguistics, and language, together with social science miscellaneous. Science System Studies is categorized as a journal of linguistics and language. Timo Marin's major work, Ecosemiotics, is published as part of a series on environmental humanities. So it seems that, and then you've got scientists like Barbieri dissociating themselves from biosemiotics, Howard Putty also, that there's a reluctance to recognize that biosemiotics is advancing science. I think that this can be understood if you look at that sort of metaphysical assumptions that define what science is. And that includes, as I've suggested, information science, informatics and so on, the most recent sort of fashion in the development of the natural sciences. If you look at the concept of Umwelten, that puts meaning into nature, and it really does challenge Cartesian dualism. The previous speaker, I think, talked about the Bonhoeffer School being influenced by idealism. I think that's true. I mean, he put forward a whole lot of ideas that scientists didn't like, so that he tended to be a bit marginalized, even by people who are ethologists, influenced by his work. But what he was doing was, as I said, radically changing the way science was understood and developing it in a way that linked it to the humanities. And Heidegger took up the notion of Umwelt and further developed it, developing the notion of the Mitwelt and the Eigenwelt to go along with the Umwelt. Merleau-Ponty again embraced these ideas and further developed them, probably influenced by Heidegger, but also independently studying the work of Bonhoeffer School. These thinkers, Husserl took up the ideas, and people influenced by him developing the notion of the life world, which is really the further development of the notion of the Umwelt. And the Umwelt was sort of more basic, the condition for the development of the life world. So I suppose I look at all different countries, but my own experience is that you're really up against it in defending biosemiotics. In universities, the humanities are now being marginalized more than ever, and approaches which really do challenge the dominant ways of thinking tend to be not taken seriously, not even argued with. So I think that you then have to think about, what kind of discourse biosemiotics is. Is it science or literature or both or something more? And that's what I want to argue, that it's both science and literature and something more. It involves metaphysical thinking. It enters the realm of metaphysical discourse, which has been well and truly marginalized by logical positivists who defined science in opposition to metaphysics. But if you think of Jürgen Habermas, he also read a book on post-metaphysical philosophy, just dismissing metaphysics as idealist and writing a chapter on Peirce and just dismissing his work as trying to do something which was impossible. So what I'm setting out to do is opposing those positions and defending metaphysics and the importance of it. So why has scientific materialism prevailed for so long? Partly it's because philosophers have entrenched it through rejecting metaphysics, developing epistemologies, focusing on epistemology rather than metaphysics, that is, the question of what is being, and developing an epistemology that just didn't give a place to metaphysical thinking. And you can see this, looking at the whole history of the development of it. So you can see that, with the mechanical view of the world, Descartes' first philosophy puts the subject at the center, working out what kind of knowledge they can achieve. Later on, the empiricists did the same thing, and in the process just dismissed metaphysics. Logical positivism was a kind of combination of Descartes' rationalism and empiricism, combining the two by drawing upon symbolic logic. And again, it was defining finding science in opposition to metaphysics. And that had a huge effect in the Anglophone countries, eliminating metaphysicians from academic positions. And that way of thinking, that development of philosophy is spread around the world. So even French philosophy is now dominated by that kind of thinking. It's not necessarily called logical positivism, logical empiricism, but just generally analytic philosophy. Again, which implies not giving a place to speculation, which is what metaphysics makes central. Now, the logical positivists define what knowledge is in a way that guaranteed the preeminence of reductionist thinking, because they talked about scientific knowledge being cumulative, by later theories being more general, encompassing earlier theories. And the later theories, the most general theories, had to be physical theories. That is, physics has to be basic. Everything ultimately has to be explained in terms of physics. So that's why you get the idea that we're machines for reproducing DNA, and DNA just thought of as bits of information equated to negative entropy or whatever. So what you now have is the dominance in the world of scientism, and that affects how the human sciences are understood, the preeminence of particular kind of economic theories utilizing mathematical models, essentially neoclassical economics, but essentially the ideas that are underpinning neoliberalism. And they, I think, all reinforce Nietzsche's conclusions, and a marginalization of not only the humanities, but humanistic approaches in the human sciences, despite the previous speaker talking about really great developments in that area. So what role does Peirce play in all this? Well, clearly Peirce's concept of semiosis being embraced by biosemiotics, beginning, I think, with Hofmeyr, and then being taken up elsewhere, provided a way of greatly advancing and developing more rigorously von Oxen's research program. And I think that's really important. But one of the other things that he did was developed an understanding of logic as semiotics, understood as being triadic, which granted a place to abduction, which is speculation. And it really was a major challenge to logical positivism. I mean, there are some philosophers who promote Peirce's work, Susan Hark, for instance. And I think they can't be, I mean, they're really a powerful opponent of mainstream analytic philosophy. And I think that's really important, that what you've got is somebody who was at the forefront of developing logic, symbolic logic, and yet instead of using that to negate the ideas of idealists and what have you, actually supported them. So abduction gave a place to speculation, creative thinking, which is really what ultimately metaphysics is. I mean, not all speculation is metaphysics, but it's usually within the framework of broader speculations, with metaphysics providing the ultimate speculation, the ultimate characterization of what there is in the universe, where the other theorists try to situate their work. So it made possible challenging the prevailing assumptions. And Peirce characterized himself as a metaphysician and defended metaphysics. He argued that scientific hypotheses are not merely concerned with prediction, they must also connect facts with our general conceptions of the universe. Science and metaphysics are indissociable. Find a scientific man who proposes to get along without metaphysics, Peirce wrote, and you have found one whose doctrines are thoroughly vitiated by the crude and uncriticized metaphysics with which they are packed. And I think that is the case. That thinkers these days, because of the marginalization of metaphysical discourse, are dominated by assumptions that they're unaware of, and that affects their judgments about everything. And it really has committed them to effectively being nihilists. He then characterized his own work as metaphysics. The undertaking which this volume inaugurates is to make a philosophy like that of Aristotle, that is to say, an outline of a theory of comprehensive that is so comprehensive that for a long time to come, the entire work of human reason in philosophy of every school and kind, in mathematics and psychology, in physical science and history, in sociology, and in whatever other department there may be, shall appear as the filling out of its details. The first step towards this is, I don't know where my head's there, the simple aspects of every subject. Now, if you look at Whitehead's work, it's really saying the metaphysical revolution of the 17th century replaced the Aristotelian framework, and some thinkers have tried to maintain or revive that metaphysical framework of Aristotle. But I think that the achievements of the mechanists make it very difficult to do that. What you require is more creative thinking, and I think that this is really what came about with the reaction against scientific materialism in Germany. So to begin with, you try to have Kant sort of marginalizing the mechanistic view of the world by treating it as only dealing with the realm of appearances. I mean, there's far more to it than that, but in that way, giving a place to ethics which could be grounded in the numinal realm rather than the phenomenal realm. You get his disciples or students, Herder, Fichte, and so on, and then Hegel, and then Schelling, trying to radicalize Kant's ideas in a way, I think, which was very successful, associated with the development of a whole range of other disciplines like hermeneutics, but also developments of new ways of characterizing physical existence. So if you look at what Peirce was doing, starting off with symbolic logic and characterizing it as semiotics, initially, when he was to begin with, his starting point was Kant. His father discussed Kant with him when he was just a high school student, and that had to be his sort of reference point. Later on, when he encountered the work of Hegel and Schelling, he was fairly dismissive of them. But then he came to appreciate Hegel as one of the greatest thinkers ever. And later still, he came to identify himself as a Schellingian philosopher. And he wrote to William James, "My views were probably influenced by Schelling, by all stages of Schelling, but especially by the philosophy de nature. I consider Schelling enormous, and one thing I admire about him is his freedom from the trammels of system, and his holding himself uncommitted to any previous utterance. In that, he is like a scientific man. If you were to call my philosophy a Schellingianism, transformed in the light of modern physics, I should not take it hard." In fact, Schelling followed other philosophers, arguing that system is impossible, but necessary to strive for. That is, you try to give your understanding of the world coherence, knowing that the world is too complex ever to be fully comprehended, but you work towards it, and you are prepared to continually modify your ideas. And so people who quote some passage out of Peirce to dismiss all of biosemiotics are sort of misunderstanding what Peirce was doing in following Schelling. But the tradition that Schelling really started was that of process metaphysics, process relational metaphysics, taking processes as the fundamental existence rather than bits of matter or whatever, or information, if you like. And this is really what biosemiotics is semiotics, Peirce's semiotics, also embraces from effectively developing Peirce's ideas, Schelling's ideas. The Schelling's metaphysics, as I said, he began as an idealist, influenced by Kant's student Fichte, and aligning himself with Fichte, but also embracing a lot of Herder's work, who's, I think, a highly original thinker, tends to be underestimated, but I won't go into his work. He was a friend of Hegel, and they developed their ideas together. But Schelling was different from Hegel in that he privileged natural philosophy and argued that we need a philosophical physics to challenge Newtonian science. So taking up the more radical aspects of Kant's philosophy, he wasn't prepared to just accept the dominance of Newtonian physics. He argued that you could replace it. And you could replace it not only the basic concepts, but also the mathematics, developing a new form of mathematics that would be adequate to a fluid, creative world. And in the process, he worked towards reconciling science, art, and the humanities. Again, building on Kant's more radical ideas. He's been characterized as developing a hermeneutics of nature by Ian Hamilton and Grant, and as naturalizing the transcendental. That is, that instead of seeing the categories as deriving from transcendental deduction, somehow based in the transcendental ego, he saw them as developing by humans who were within nature, constrained by it in their thinking. So it emerged through their thinking, where concepts develop first of all through people's practical engagement in the world before being elaborated and further developed in reflective thinking. So you have to participate in nature to fully understand it. And the important thing about Schelling is that it tends to be dismissed as a romantic, but in fact, when you look at the history of science, he had a huge impact on the development of science, the development of field theory by Faraday, for instance, and then Maxwell, Einstein. Really was a development of what Schelling is not to philosophy, and he claimed that himself. The development of the first law of thermodynamics, inspired by Schelling, but then the development of post-reductionist biology, very strongly influenced by Schelling. The idea of an Umwelt actually had been anticipated by Schelling, who argued that living beings constantly interacting with their environment in order to maintain their form, and in doing so, find their environment in relationship to themselves. So it wasn't only what Kant was talking about, us having concepts that interpret the world, but so do animals. And you can see, what biosemiotics have argued, that Levi Cole talking about vegetative semiosis being foundational, then that being the condition for animal semiosis, then the condition for human semiosis, that all sort of fits into that framework of thinking. But he was elaborating a full metaphysical theory, which was essentially a form of process metaphysics, assuming an unprethinkable being, opposing Hegel's characterizing being as just an abstract concept, saying that was the starting point for all our thinking, our inquiries, our actions, and so on. We're always situated within the world. This is where Heidegger also influenced by Schelling in that regard. So objects have to be taken as derivative. Chemicals, for instance, are the products of opposing forces generated by activities. And he really anticipated the idea of valencies and helped put chemistry on a solid scientific foundation. So Peirce, claiming to be a Schellingian, accepted all those ideas, the primacy that we're practically engaged in the world before we engage in reflection, that we're participants within the world that we're trying to understand. So it's to some extent through us that the world is becoming comprehensible, and that's built into his, his notion of logic as semiotic, with its triadic structure, in which dynamical objects play a causal role, while still defending speculation and upholding a fallibilist metaphysics while avoiding skepticism, because you had this semiosis that responds to earlier science trying to overcome their limitations, and that can be an endless process, which is very different from most metaphysics of the past, which always involved trying to find a method that gave you absolutely certain knowledge on which everything could be founded. So Schelling, I think, was the first person to argue for a fallibilist metaphysics, and Peirce was following Schelling in that regard. Schelling, as I said, talked about an unprethinkable being preceding all our thoughts and actions and so on, and it's always beyond our full comprehension. So that was a modification of the way Aristotle had characterized being, and Peirce followed Schelling, arguing that it's a germinal mode of being, which he explained elsewhere as being in possibility, illustrated by seeds of plants and laws of nature. But it's a world where there are open possibilities. It's a creative world where new kind of possibilities can come into existence and be actualized that have never existed before. It's a creative world that gave rise to life and then humanity. And what he's providing is the metaphysics that makes that comprehensible, whereas mainstream thinking is always about explaining away. I suppose nobility is some kind of illusion, as Nietzsche pointed out, according to the dominant science. Whitehead provided further defense of metaphysics, which I think very much concurs with Peirce's work, its fallibilists and so on. But the important thing about Whitehead is he provided a better history of the background to what he was defending. The different metaphysical systems, I think, mesh with each other, as other figures have pointed out. But what he pointed out was just how important metaphysics is to civilization. Without metaphysical presupposition, there can be no civilization. So it's not just that metaphysics is required for any kind of inquiry, it's required for there to be a civilization. And the civilization of modernity, I think, is really a civilization based on scientific materialism, although ameliorated to some extent by art and literature, but they're having a less and less influence. So the challenge to replace scientific materialist metaphysical presuppositions of modernity is really a challenge to create a new civilization. And I think that that's how Peirce's evolutionary metaphysics should be understood. Now, these ideas, I'm not sure how much time I've taken up too much time. These ideas really gained support by the turn against logical positivism in the second half of the 19th century, particularly in the 1950s, with people like Norwood, Russell, Hanson, strongly influenced by Peirce, reintroducing the notion of abduction, drawing upon Peirce's analysis of Kepler's work, for instance, and Michael Polanyi's book, Personal Knowledge, which was strongly influenced by Dilthey and hermeneutics, and argued that in understanding the world, in developing our knowledge, we actually are understanding it. That's it involves a kind of gestalt instruments like gestalt psychology, where whatever you focus upon is made sense of in terms of a background. We tend to ignore that background. And in the case of most science, the background has to be the experimental conditions, which are the boundary conditions where you reveal the world as forces that can be predicted and what have you. And Polanyi in particular then attacked nihilism quite explicitly, utilizing that notion of indwelling, and went on to defend art and so on. And later philosophers of science, influenced by history, can be seen as further developing those ideas, but more cautiously, people like Thomas Kuhn and Imre Lakatos. So the whole discipline of history and philosophy of science provides a strong background for opposing, this marginalization of biosemiotics, but it hasn't been fully drawn upon, which I think it should be. But also that's involved in giving a place to metaphysics. And in the case of Polanyi, it was about defending hierarchical ontology, which then influenced Howard Putty, who talked about how matter becomes a symbol, and that developed ideas that were embraced by some biosemiotics, Tony Salter, for instance. Now, trying to look at how you do defend the diverse, make judgments between diverse metaphysical systems, which have to be comprehensive and therefore tend to be internally coherent, but define their own criteria of validity. And it's important to appreciate the role of narratives in this. And because I'm running late, I won't read out McIntyre's famous sentence about this, how Galileo was able to justify his radical change in the very meaning of science by virtue of his ability to tell a story from the perspective of the development of his own ideas. And the same happened with Darwin, major change in the way science was understood, able to be defended because he could construct a history of past science to show how previous work had achieved things but was limited and had to fail because of its limitations and had to be transcended. And that's really, how you justify a process. Relational process metaphysics. The thing about process metaphysics is that it also enables you through semiotics, and I think Persian semiotics, despite not really engaging with narratology, enables you to make intelligible that whole way of making judgments. But the thing about the narratives is not just about the ideas, they're about the forms of life that generate those ideas. And ultimately, looking at the study of the development of the mechanical view of the world, we really need a study of the development of Western European civilization, the sort of thing that Joseph Needham did, or looking at the development of Darwinian evolutionary theory, the sort of thing that Robert Young did, looking at Darwin's metaphor and appreciating on that basis how oppressive these ideas were. But the alternative metaphysics, formulated from the perspective of a radically different metaphysics, then can interpret the past, understand its achievements, but also project a different kind of future, envisage a future that people could aspire to realize. And that's what I want to argue that this new metaphysics does. And the importance of biosemiotics is that it's absolutely central to developing these radically new concepts, because it's that crucial conjunction between the natural sciences and the human sciences, looking at what life is. It's actually, in a sense, in supporting the Levin's philosophy movement, celebrating the value of life, which had developed to some extent, trying to avoid the brutality of Nietzsche's call for a will to power, so more like a will to life rather than a will to power.
Arran, we are at time.
Okay, you're at time, so I'll leave it at that. So I think you get the idea of where it's all heading and how I'm defending the work of the theoretical biologists by virtue of their contribution to all this. So shall I close my PowerPoint presentation?
Great. Thank you so much. Maybe one or two super quick questions while we set up. Yeah, John.
Hi, Arran. It's John Pickering here. Good to see you back in town.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Oh, sorry.
You should probably come up to the computer.
Can you hear this?
Yeah, I can. Yeah.
Hi, Arran. It's John Pickering here. Good to see you back in town. I'll email you some things about this, but I couldn't agree more that biosemiotics is fundamentally a metaphysical challenge, and that's why it's being marginalized, and that's our problem. My question to you is, what can we do politically, both in the academy and outside, to help with the meta crisis that we're facing?
Well, I tend to focus on the threat of global ecological destruction to the whole future of humanity, to argue for a fundamental challenge of our institutions. We're going in the wrong direction. The transformation of universities into business corporations has done more to marginalize all these challenges. And, neoliberalism is really based on mechanistic thinking, Homo economicus as a kind of, Hobbesian machine moved by appetites and aversions. So I think that what I've come to realize is it has to be a global struggle. I mean, what's paralyzed the opposition to what's going on is this incredulity towards grand narratives defended by Lyotard. He didn't explicitly claim he was defending them, but he was. And these deconstructive postmodernists who claim to be radical have actually been disastrous. We need a vision of the future. And I suppose that the failure of the Soviet Union has been a huge problem, because it looks as though there, as Thatcher said, there's no alternative. But there is, kind of green a green democratic socialism or social democracy, sort of thing that Jeffrey Sachs is arguing for. I think that we have to have that vision of the future so we can coordinate people all around the world to move in the same kind of direction. So I think what we've seen, and this is where Nietzsche is right, the complete domination of the world by this nihilistic vision, so that people are paralyzed even in the face of the global ecological crisis. But that really brings home, the importance of challenging these institutions and developing alternative institutions, alternative economic theories, which have to be situated in the context of human ecology, which has to embrace biosemiotics.
Thank you so much for joining us.